Um, and for the past little while, we've been following a theme that we've entitled The Wheel, the Path, and the Goal. So the wheel, where we are, the path that leads to enlightenment, and the goal. So we started out looking at the wheel of life, this incredibly rich composite symbol. And we saw how this describes our usual existential situation. When we allow our past to condition how we think and how we act and how we speak in the present. So our past rules our present, and our present, of course, creates the future. The way we act in the present creates the future. So we go round and round. We go round and round on automatic pilot unless we do something about it. The world pushes our buttons and we react in the usual way. We try to push away what feels unpleasant to us, and we try to grab what we regard as pleasant. We do the same old things over and over again, so we go round and round on this wheel. And then, there's a lot of really interesting detail in the traditional image of the wheel, which we went into to some extent, about all the different states of being that we could be in, that we could experience as we go around on the wheel, some very pleasant and some very unpleasant. But we saw that the real goal is not to get into one of the pleasant states, which can only ever last a little while, can only ever be temporary. The real goal is to get off the wheel altogether and onto the path. And we also saw that the outer rim of the wheel, there's images in the outer rim of the wheel that tell us where the door is, the door off the wheel, where the portal is that takes us out of the wheel of life and onto the path, onto a very, very different world, a new approach to life. And we saw that this portal is none other than the famous gap, the gap that we all heard about on our introductory course. It's the point where we have a choice, the point where we can choose to not avoid what feels unpleasant and go for grab what feels pleasant, but to act creatively. To act creatively instead of reacting, so that we do something new, something that leads to a better outcome. We could think of loads of examples. So at the simplest level, the smoker decides to ignore the discomfort from not getting their fix of nicotine and does something different, doesn't reach for the cigarette, and they said that sets them out on a path to a better place, ultimately more happiness, although initially a certain amount of discomfort. Or we're bored, but we choose to meditate or go for a walk instead of reaching for the phone and distracting ourselves in response to the discomfort of boredom. And again, we set up a movement to a better place. So when we do that sort of thing, instead of going around in a vicious circle, we set up a virtuous spiral, we could say, where we get to better and better places, and ultimately to enlightenment itself, to the goal. And that's what I'm going to be talking about tonight, and that's what we're going to be exploring in greater detail over the next few weeks. So if this is your first time on a Tuesday, you've joined a really good place, because you've missed all the bad stuff about some of the unpleasant places we could end up in on the wheel, and now we're going to look at how good it could be. So a couple of weeks ago, Sangha Gita talked about the Buddha in the period moving up to his enlightenment, the period just before his enlightenment, onto his enlightenment. And she showed us how that mythic story, the mythic story that surrounds that, which described what went on in the Buddha's inner world. She described how that told us a lot about, it illustrated really vividly a lot of what we have to overcome on the path to move towards enlightenment. And tonight I'm going to follow on from that story of the Buddha's enlightenment and talk about the Buddha after his enlightenment experience, the Buddha as the enlightened being, the Buddha as the goal. So yeah, traditionally in Buddhism, the Buddha has been seen as the most universal and important symbol of the enlightened human being, the goal of the path. But what does it mean? So what does it mean to be enlightened? Well, I suppose a good place to start, if we're going to talk about what it means to be enlightened, might be to hear what Sangharakshita has to say about this, the founder of our movement. So he says, to begin with, enlightenment is a state of pure, clear, radiant awareness. In this state of awareness, the subject-object duality is no longer experienced. There is no out there and there's no in here. That distinction is entirely transcended. There is only one continuous, pure, clear awareness extending in all directions. It is, moreover, an awareness of things as they really are, which is not things in the sense of objects, but things as transcending the duality of subject and object. Hence, this clear, pure awareness is also spoken of as an awareness of reality. But this is not knowledge in the ordinary sense, but rather a state of direct, unmediated vision that sees all things directly, clearly, vividly, and truly. It is a spiritual vision, a transcendental vision, which is free from all delusion, all wrong thinking, all crooked thinking, all vagueness, all obscurity, all mental conditioning, and all prejudice. First of all, then, enlightenment is this state of pure, clear awareness. Secondly, it is a state of intense, profound, overflowing love and compassion. Thirdly, enlightenment consists in a state of inexhaustible mental and spiritual energy. This state of enlightenment is one of absolute spontaneity, continually bubbling forth, a state of uninterrupted creativity. Enlightenment is also a state of perfect, unconditioned freedom from all subjective limitations. This then is how enlightenment is usually described. But of course, enlightenment cannot really be put into words or separated into parts. So that might be as close to a good description of the state of enlightenment as we're going to get in prose language, in words. It's quite inspiring. It sounds great. It sounds quite inspiring. But does it help us to imagine what enlightenment would be like? So we humans, if we want to achieve anything, we need a goal we can imagine, that motivates us, a goal that motivates us that we can move towards. And it's then that we put in the effort. That is how we tend to work. We imagine what we want to move towards, and we make the effort to move towards it. So if we take the Buddha as our archetype of enlightenment, how can we imagine the Buddha as a goal that we desire so that we are motivated to move towards it? Especially if, as Sangharakshita said, enlightenment, the state of enlightenment cannot be put into words. So unfortunately, that's not an easy question to answer, because the Buddha is not like anything in our experience, and we've heard that this state cannot be put into words. Very often we do describe him in ways that we do have some experience of, as Sangharakshita does. We talk about things like his compassion, which is born in the mud and grows up through the dirty water until it stands above the water, quite unstained by the water. So I was born in the world. I've grown in the world until I rose above the world, so that I now stand clear of the world, quite unstained by the world. So I think there's a lot in that, just like a lotus, which is born in the horrible mud at the bottom of an Indian lake and grows up through the muddy, dirty water until it stands above the water. They're like water lilies. If you look at a water lily, absolutely pristine and pure, beautiful. unstained by the water, so I was born in the world. I've grown in the world until I rose above the world, and I stand clear of the world, quite unstained by the world. Then he responds to Dana's desire to put him into a category. So he says, I've told you what I'm not. Just think about me, Brahmin, as awakened. And that's how we've named the Buddha ever since, because Buddha simply means one who is awake. One has woken up. The Buddha has woken up. He has risen above the world in the way that we maybe rise out of a troubled dream when we wake up. We all know what it's like to wake up out of a troubled dream. Suddenly we realize, it's all right. It's all right. There's a sense of relief. We know that the things we were afraid of can't hurt us. They're not going to happen. The things we were chasing after were not real. That awful problem that was really bothering us in the dream didn't exist. We are now awake. We're in, as it were, a higher reality where those things are seen as having no real existence. And the Buddha is awake. That's what he says about himself. That's what his name means. He is like someone who has awakened from a troubled dream, from the troubled dream that we're still in. He now exists in a higher, truer reality, but he still appears in our troubled dream. He walked around India. He still walks in our dream, talks in our dream, so that he can help to awaken others and rescue them from the dream. There's a Buddhist text that I rather like that tells us somewhat enigmatically that the Buddha is awake whilst we are still dreaming, but he has to use the language of the dream world to communicate with us, because this is the only language we understand. So he uses the dream world's language, although to him that language just deals in unrealities, in things that don't exist. Well, maybe another similar, more modern analogy that's sort of related to the dream one would be like movies, like The Matrix. So in the Matrix, we're all living in a virtual world created by a computer-generated world. But there are people who have escaped from that, and there are people who go back into that unreal world in order to help others to escape it. A bit similar, but the Matrix analogy breaks down because in the Matrix, the reality outside the virtual world is actually pretty grim. Whereas the higher world the Buddha wakes up into is a place of great bliss and beauty. There's a saying that crops up quite a lot in Buddhist texts, Nirvanam Paranang Sukham. Nirvana is the highest bliss. And awakening is the highest happiness, the highest health and happiness. So the Buddha is like someone who's awake, and we are like people who are dreaming. But just to avoid any misunderstanding whatsoever, I am not saying that the world is just a dream and you can go out and run in front of a 95 bus and your injuries won't matter, okay? That's not what it's saying. The idea that we're dreaming, this is a metaphor. This is a metaphor. And I think that at the highest level, metaphors are something that takes what we have an experience of and uses that to help us understand something beyond our experience. So we have experience of dreaming and we have experience of waking up, and this is used to help us to understand the awakened one and the awakened state. And really anything we can say about the awakened state and reality, it's always going to be a metaphor because it's beyond our experience. So at this point you might say, hang on Vadanya, you've talked about us still dreaming and the Buddha having woken up, and you've said that the Buddha is still there being active in the dream to help us. But the historical Buddha is no longer around, surely. are no longer there in our dream because he's been dead for thousands of years. So how can he possibly help us? Well, but many schools of Buddhism and many Buddhists, based on experience, not just on fantasy, based on experience, feel that the Buddha does still communicate to us in our troubled dream. That his enlightenment transcended time and space, so that the fact that he died thousands of years ago is no limitation. So that he can still be there for us. And he might speak to us in all sorts of ways. He might speak to us through that book that we found that just seemed so significant. It told, my life's got to change. This book that seems so significant. All those few words in a Dharma talk that just went bang right into our being. He might well speak to us through images, and we'll come back to that later. Or he might even whisper directly into our mind if we set up the conditions. So that's a bit about Dona and dreams. There's another story in the Pali Canon that points to the Buddha's extremely mysterious state. So this concerns somebody who keeps cropping up in the Pali Canon, asking the Buddha really troublesome questions. So he asks the Buddha things like, is the world eternal or isn't it? And is the soul the same as the body or isn't it? And so on. But in this particular sutta, he's a fire worshipper, incidentally. He's not a Buddhist. And in this particular sutta, he asks the Buddha, does an enlightened being continue to exist after death? And the Buddha says, I wouldn't say that, Vacchagotta. And so Vacchagotta says, well, does an enlightened being then cease to exist after death? And the Buddha says, well, I wouldn't say that, Vacchagotta. And then Vacchagotta says, well, but do you both exist and not exist after death? Well, that wouldn't be true either, Vacchagotta. Well, what about, do you neither exist nor exist or not exist after death? That wouldn't be true either, Vacchagotta. So Vacchagotta says, now I'm really confused. And the Buddha says, of course you're confused, Vacchagotta. The state of enlightenment is deep, mysterious. Only an enlightened being can know what it means. And you're not even practicing with our school, so how can you expect to understand what I'm talking about? Of course you're confused. But yeah, so the state of enlightenment is deep, it's mysterious. So how can we connect with this Buddha who exists in this state that we can't describe? We don't know what it is. The Buddha exists in this higher dimension, an awakened world. And in our present state, that awakened world is beyond our knowledge. We've heard that the Buddha was totally beyond Dona's experience, the Dona the Brahmin. And he's beyond ours too. So we can't conjure up the Buddha in our mind from what we know. We need to reach beyond what we know. We need to reach beyond our experience and beyond our present knowledge. And the faculty that allows us to reach beyond our experience, an experience of the past, because experience is all of the past, the thing that allows us to reach beyond our past experience and get a sense of what might exist in the future, that faculty is the imagination. So to get a sense of the Buddha, we need to release our imagination. We need to let our imagination off the leash. We need to do the things that nurture it. We need to allow ourselves to imagine what seems perhaps unimaginable. And well, one thing to say about that is the imagination is very rarely fired off so much by rational descriptions. It's much more likely to be fired off, for example, by images. And the imagination is often fired off by images, much more than words. And we might get a feeling for the power of images to convey something which seems non-rational. from our experience of an exercise we do in introductory classes that some of you will have done quite recently. So we ask people to just spend some time looking at an image of the Buddha by a Western artist called Alaka. And then we invite them to say what they observe. And what usually comes out from this is that people see a lot of apparently quite contradictory opposite qualities that can't really be reconciled with our present way of thinking. So people say the Buddha looks very grounded, but then also very much part of the earth, but then he's also uplifted with his head among the stars. People say that the image conveys serenity, but then others say it conveys this really active, vibrant energy. And then some say, well, the Buddha seems isolated from worldly happenings. He's got this aura that's completely protecting him from worldly goings on. But then others will say, but at the same time, he seems to be part of his surroundings. He seems to be merging into his surroundings, not separate from the world around him. And I don't think rationally we can get our head around how these different qualities could be combined using our normal rational mind. But if we sort of relax the tight focus of wanting it all to be in nice little boxes and very, very rational, if we relax the tight focus, we can perhaps let something new emerge. A feeling, a glimpse. We might get a glimpse of enlightenment in our peripheral vision rather than right at the center of our focus. We're probably not going to get a true flavor or feeling for enlightenment by just thinking about it rationally, using our dream language, which describes unreality. We have to approach it from a different direction. So one way, as I've said, could be through images that can bypass the rational mind, the rational wordy mind, and be heavy with feeling and meaning. So we might get a glimpse, a flavor, a feeling for enlightenment, what it might be like if we let our mind empty of concepts and dwell on an image. In moments where we experience great beauty, we might get a sense of it when we experience reverence and awe and mystery in the face of a landscape that dwarfs us and puts all our usual concerns in this much bigger perspective. We might get a feeling for it while chanting a mantra with others during a Buddhist ritual. And this, of course, is why Buddhism doesn't confine itself to rational words, why we use images, mantras, ritual, the imagination, attention. We have to pay attention. Not make something happen, but pay attention. And when we're in that sort of state, an image or a work of art or a tree or a sunset or a verse of Dharma or a mantra could be charged with meaning, could seem charged with a meaning that goes right beyond words. And when we're in that state, we can even begin to rise above our troubled dream. Suddenly, a problem can no longer look like a problem. Suddenly, we see how our behavior is contributing to a situation and see we've got to change it. Suddenly, our course of action becomes clear and obvious. It's as though we've risen. We're sort of less troubled by the dream. We've risen a little bit above it. And I think that this, for us, is the great goal of meditation. It's why we need to meditate. We talk about insight being the goal of meditation, but that sounds too much like some sort of rational understanding, which is not really going to connect us to the goal. So what this insight really is, I think, is when we hear that whisper of our Buddha nature, the Buddha whispering to us in our dream. And another way to talk about that, for those that know the word, would be to say it's when we hear the voice of our Shraddha, our connection to the goal, drawing us towards it. So next week, we're going to move on to look at some archetypes, some other archetypes, connected archetypes or images of enlightenment that grew out of the single image of the Buddha, and which can make this mystery of enlightenment perhaps a bit more approachable. But some homework for this week might be to put a bit more effort into setting up the conditions that allow us to hear the voice of the Buddha. This might include cutting back on all the busy input we often subject our minds to, not distracting ourselves so much with our phone and social media and so on, but giving our mind some space to expand into, some time to settle down. So setting up those conditions would also include, of course, devoting some time to meditation. And it might include, if this works for you, it might include inviting the Buddha into our meditation, imagining that we're meditating in the presence of this deeply mysterious being, this being from another dimension, this being from outside our dream, this being that who looks at us with complete understanding and complete loving compassion, and who wants nothing more than to free us from the suffering that we cause ourselves by our delusion. This higher being who can, as it were, beam positive qualities into our heart. We might use an image to help us to do that, to help bring the Buddha into our meditation, or we might use a mantra if we have a connection with one. We might use anything that works, but I've said that the rational prose descriptions might not help us much to get a feel for the Buddha. But as well as images and so on, language can be used as poetry. And poetry can take us into this realm of fuzzy, undefined meaning that can sometimes give us this glimpse or this taste of something beyond our experience. So I'm going to end this talk by reading a poem, or part of a poem, in praise of the Buddha, adapted from a text called the Tamsika Sutra. And perhaps you could also use this poem to bring the Buddha into your meditation if it speaks to you. If it's okay with the team, I'll send it to the center and perhaps it could be made available somehow. So from the Tamsika Sutra. As the Buddha takes his seat on the throne of enlightenment, his clear, radiant light, like 1,000 suns, lights up the whole of space. As the Buddha takes his seat on the throne of enlightenment at the foot of the great tree, a deep and awesome roar shakes the world in all the 10 directions. The truly awake, the great sage emerges, understanding all things, gone to the other shore, filling space with clear light, rocking the world like an earthquake. See him sitting on the diamond seat of enlightenment, waking up to all wisdom, ending darkness and suffering. See him walking from place to place, his body full of virtues, mindful, thoughtful, the great man walking like a lion. See the supreme teacher, full of great compassion, turning the wheel of the teachings, freeing countless beings. The enlightened one, most free, transcending the world, relying on nothing, liberating beings from suffering. Unaffected, unattached, not trapped in mental constructions, his mind gone beyond all boundaries. The clear light of his enlightened wisdom pervades everywhere, never fading, never changing. His voice fills the world, speaking to each in his own language, telling the way to freedom, filling the mind with joy. Just as water flows under the ground everywhere, at all times, and can be found by those who dig, the Buddha's wisdom is like this. The Buddha's all-pervading wisdom is in the mind of all beings, wrapped in deluded thoughts, but they are not aware. Just as ultimate reality has no limits, beyond time, but present in all times, the realm of the Buddha is like this, pervading all times without hindrance. The truly awake, the great sage, gone to the other shore, the friend of the world, whose sphere is endless, with wisdom and energy beyond measure, who from the depths of his great compassion causes us to seek the noble Dharma. Thank you.